The State of the Industry podcast takes off now.
My name is Jim Higgins. I'm a professor at the University of North Dakota, John D. Odegaard School of Aerospace Sciences. I've been teaching there since about summer 2002. Prior to that, I was in the airlines, come from a flying family. My dad's a retired airline pilot. My wife's a current airline pilot. And so I've been studying the pilot supply since 2009 in detail and have published several forecasts on it.
Avination, what is going on? And welcome to this special episode of the Pilot to Pilot podcast. This is the episode on coronavirus and its effects on the aviation industry. Today is Sunday, March 15th at 1:30 p.m. and this is what we know so far. American Airlines has cut international flying by 75%. They're grounding most of its wide-body fleet from March 16th to at least May 6th. American is only going to be operating 3 long-haul routes during March through May. They're going to operate Dallas to London, Dallas to Tokyo, and Miami to London. What we know from Delta is they are going to cut global capacity by 40% and park up to 300 jets. This includes both narrow bodies and wide bodies, and they see the demand plummet amid the coronavirus outbreak. United was the first to react, and they have at least a system capacity cut of 20% beyond April through the summer. Now, a lot can change as we go on, and even from when you listen to this is a day-by-day reaction. This podcast could be all different by the time you listen to this next week. That's why I wanted to get it out the same day I recorded it. Now, I put out a poll on Instagram of who I should think of and who I should bring on to talk about this. And I was first brought up with Martin Rottler, who is my professor at Ohio State, now works at Envoy. And he put me in touch with Jim Higgins. Jim Higgins is a department chair and a professor at the University of North Dakota's Aviation Department. And he was the perfect candidate. He knows so much about this. He's very knowledgeable. He's done research. He has done pilot shortage research, and he has produced some pretty cool things from that. And he just has done a lot about this. He knows a lot and has been around and has seen the downturns and has seen the effects that this can have on it. Some of the things Jim and I talk about in this episode are just where we are right now. Just the truth and honest facts, what the airline industry is looking at, the demand cuts, what the future may hold, what could happen when we get out of this, and what airlines, and specifically certain airlines that might be hurt more than others. We also talk about how the American airlines, not just American, but United, Delta, Southwest, American, and all the other ones, were in a pretty good position for this. Not saying that they're perfect, but they were better than they ever could be to come into a situation like we're seeing now. Avination, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. It is not an easy one to have. It is not an easy conversation to have. This is not to spark any fear in anyone. This is just to promote the facts. This is just to see where we are, where we're headed, and what could happen, and where we are going to go, and how, yes, how we will and can recover from this. Avination, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you do enjoy this episode, please leave us a review on iTunes. That's the only thing I'm going to plug today because this is more important than anything. So leave us a review on iTunes and let us know. Share this with all your friends. Share this with all your aviation buddies and just get this podcast out there. So without any further ado, Avination, here is Jim Higgins. Jim, what is going on? Welcome to the Pilot podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem. I wish that this was on better terms. I wish we had this was us meeting for the first time and talking about how great the airline industry is and how we are just continuing to see just great growth and a lot of money in. But as the airlines do, they are very cyclical, and it seems that we are entering the downturn of what was the golden age almost. Like, what's kind of your take on just briefly of what you see the industry as right now? Do you think it's in a full-blown recession, or do you think this is a minor blip?
Well, there's not enough information yet to definitively say, is it going to be minor or is it going to trigger a recession? We absolutely have seen massive capacity cuts, especially on the international side. Domestically, we're starting to see some effects as well. It is true that the last time we've had any kind of a downturn was the 2007, 2009, what they now call the Great Recession, the bathtub recession. And you're right, especially working at the University of North Dakota with a lot of young aviators, they have not been exposed to this type of a downturn before. So there is a lot of uncertainty. And one of the things we can do is we can look at some of the past downturns and some of the events that cause those downturns and see if there's any kind of an analogous experience or any kind of data that might direct us in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we have to. We have to look at past situations. It's kind of how we prepare for the future. It just seems like this one might be a lot different than we ever expected. And I know people have always been talking, oh, the recession's coming, we have to have a correction, but I don't think anyone ever expected it to be a drop off like it is or what we're seeing right now. And like you said, we don't have enough information. This is still very much in the early stages. I know airlines are cutting and slashing and they are preparing kind of for the worst case scenario. And I hope that what we are doing is enough. But yeah, it's definitely interesting times at all. And it's funny you talk about your students and how they've never seen this before, because I've really never seen this before. I'm only 30. I'm in the aviation industry. I've seen it with my dad because he's an airline pilot, so I knew it was there. But this is the first time it could be actually affecting me. And I'm embarrassed to say that I've always on the podcast said like it's a very cyclical industry, but in my mind, I always never really thought it was going to happen again. You know, I always thought that, hey, how could it happen? No, there's no way there'll ever be furloughs because so many people are retiring or the airlines are in such good shape. They're making so much money, but here we are again. And it just has proven over and over again that the airlines truly are a cycle. And this is truly something that there's always going to be something that could hurt the airlines.
No, that's absolutely correct. I've been in the industry myself for many, many years, a lot longer than you. And like you came from an airline family. And it does seem that we do talk about it being cyclical, but until you're actually facing that, until you start evaluating how that's going to affect yourself personally and some of the negative ramifications, you're absolutely right. It can be really disturbing. The good news is if there is good news, I think there is. The good news is we've seen disruptions before, and the airlines have shown to be very resilient. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to return. Sometimes it happens a lot more quickly, but whatever the case may be, it's not uncharted territory. Just looking at my own father, he was furloughed from Northwest in the 60s. He was on strike at Continental and never got back in the 80s. And you just see it all around. My wife was furloughed from Masaba in the mid 2000s. So, I mean, it does, it has been part of it. A lot of times people get in a situation, they think, if times are really good, this is how it's going to be from here on out. If times are really bad, here's how it's going to be from this time out. And that's not correct, right? We know it's cyclical, and we just had an extended up period, and now we're in a little bit of a down period.
Yeah, a very extended up period, or it almost looked like it could never possibly go back down because, just whenever, like you said, extended period uptime, you kind of forget about the bad times. And when you're in the bad times, it's only been a week or so, and people are already thinking about how it's the worst industry and everyone's going to lose their job, which we don't know yet. That might not be the case. But what we do know, these are kind of the facts that we have in front of us. And we talked about a little bit of this earlier, but American Airlines has said they are cutting international flying by 75%. They also came out, I think it was today or yesterday, saying they're grounding most of its wide body fleet from March 16th to May 6th. And they're going to operate only 3 long-haul routes during March and through May, and that is DFW to London, Heathrow, and Tokyo, and then also Miami to London. So I know American Airlines wasn't as kind of, they didn't operate as much, they have as much of a footprint over in Asia. I know they were more focused probably on Europe and South America, so that's going to be interesting to see how that goes too, and they've already kind of cut those flights, as we just talked about. And then Delta has reduced their overall flying by 40% globally, and they're parking 300 jets, and United is kind of still status quo on what they came out with probably a week ago, which I think was about 20% cuts for global, but they also seem to be the ones that are hit worst with the Asia shutdown.
Yeah, there's no doubt this is unprecedented. One of the things we have to keep in mind is the airlines, they are the first to see through their reservation systems what the behavior is going to be in the future. And, you saw Ed Bastian from Delta Airlines come out last week and say, at that time that cancellations were exceeding new reservations, which I think is unprecedented. When you hear that, it shows the fear that people have, and obviously doesn't bode well, for the next couple months, for sure. No doubt these are drastic cuts. No doubt they will have some undefined term of longevity. We do know eventually the resiliency of the industry is it will come back, but the question is when.
Yeah, and the question is also how it will come back. I think that, depending on how long this lasts, I don't know. The future of some airlines might have to be consolidated. I know that's probably more of a fact over in Europe than it is in the States because we were in such a strong boom. And I think the airlines, most of them, if not all of them, were in such a good position to weather the storm. But in Europe, you have kind of Norwegian, which is falling apart. I think KLM was given. I think they have where they only had 6 weeks left to operate as they are, or something like that. Which I don't know the factual basis behind that. It could just be like airline forums or just rumors going on. But I know that the American Airlines, United, Delta, and even the other ones are doing much better or are much better positioned than some of the carriers over in Europe or in Asia.
There's no doubt. There's a few things the airlines have learned. Well, more than a few, but few key things the airlines have learned about making money since the early days of the 2000s after 9/11. One of the big lessons learned was ancillary income. I know that from a consumer point of view, consumers groan about the baggage fees, the seat placement fees, all the other things, the upgrades and whatnot. But the truth is, that's been a tremendous amount of revenue that did not exist during the 9/11 recovery, nor did it exist during the SARS disruptions, 2002, 2004. We did see it 2007, 2009. And there's still actually, to borrow a cliche, meat on the bone there. There's a lot of more opportunity for ancillary income. Also, if you want to look for a silver lining, you probably know about fuel, the cost of oil. Right now, that's gone way down. And so that will absolutely help the domestic airlines for sure manage. Most of them were not overly hedged. There's a couple of exceptions to that. So they're paying at the pump and going to be doing quite well for themselves. And I will also say one other thing. I also come from a little bit of a union background, and I have not always been the biggest fan of management teams in the industry. But I will tell you, I've been quite impressed over the last 3 to 4 years with some of the different management folks that have risen to the top of these airlines. They seem to really have this nailed down. And even though we're in very uncertain times, I have no doubt that they're going to put together, really well optimized plans to help navigate out of this. I really do believe that. I think in the years past, maybe we might have had some doubts about some of the leaders, but by and large, I think we've got some good people there.
Yeah, I would agree. And Ed Bastian, like we talked about, is kind of stepping out and taking 6 months off of pay. He might be making a ton of money and he might have the means to do it, or maybe there's a kickback later in his contract, but it's still a very honorable thing to do and it's still doing something. And I would like to see more people that are in a situation like that kind of offer the same thing. I'm not saying they take no money, but kind of just everyone needs to give, it's a thing like right now it could be the most important thing is making sure these airlines stay and making sure we do everything we can to have a job in 2 years or something like that. So I think it's very honorable that Ed was able to do that.
I completely agree. And, a lot of the recovery in the industry is going to be all about confidence, the consumer confidence, the employee confidence, just the overall economic confidence. And when you do things like this, where you have an overt symbol to everyone saying, hey, I'm going to share some of the pain too. I agree. I have to applaud that as well.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about how they see this first. So airlines are seeing that future bookings, the cancellations are outweighing the amount of bookings that they're having. Now, I also think that is obviously, like we're talking about, that is fear driven, and the airlines and the industry, and everyone needs to come up and they need to figure out a way to restore confidence. And I don't know how they're going to do that in the future or when that is possible to do, because right now it might not be the safest thing to fly and go to all these places because spreading the disease, whatever it may be. But that can also change really fast. So say like in 2 weeks they figure out that the curve is finally flattening and people are like, hey, it's probably a little bit safer, and then future bookings can be kind of put back out there. So when they say that the future bookings are not the same as the cancellations, I feel like that could really change kind of like overnight or even weekly. So I don't know. I feel like that was just kind of an interesting way to talk about that, if that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense. So here's the thing. When we look back at 9/11, for instance, when the airlines redeployed and put flights back in the air, I think they started on September 14th, 15th, somewhere in there, bookings were really, really low. And the reason for that, for those of us that lived through that, if you recall, it absolutely was a time when we didn't know if the terrorists were going to strike again. We didn't know if the security protocols were where they needed to be. And so there still was a lot of fear. I think it might be different here somewhat once that the pandemic comes under control, and it will come under control. It's just a matter of when. But once it comes under control and runs its course, I do think that fear it's very different. I do agree with you. It should go away a lot more quickly than we saw with 9/11 and with some of the economic issues, because people will feel a lot safer traveling. One point on that, I don't know if you've seen some of the social media campaigns. I hate to keep calling out Delta. I think a lot of the airlines are doing some great things, but Delta started a social media campaign. I've seen it on several of my social media accounts, where they're actually going through and showing how the aircraft is cleaned, how the HEPA filters are changed. And I think that's actually very important. Right now everyone's caught up in, quite frankly, a panic. A lot of people are. But as we subside and as we rebound, that type of a campaign, I think, is going to be crucial to help alleviate that fear.
I agree. And I think it's going to change the way it's going to create more expenses for the airlines in the future, because I think this is going to be kind of this is how they're going to have to do it from here on out. Like, passengers aren't going to be okay. They're always going to know how the plane is clean, just because this is going to scare people for like we talked about, it's not going to be as bad as 9/11. The fear is a little bit different, because once we get this under control, it's completely under control. Like, a pandemic's not just going to happen out of thin air again, hopefully not in the next 2 weeks or a year after this, but they're going to have to clean these planes like this for probably the next foreseeable future, and for as long as airlines are operating, I would imagine.
There's no doubt about it. I think people will become better educated, sometimes, maybe a little overly educated in some areas, but it'll be absolutely critical that airlines front and center showcase their efforts to, biologically decontaminate things and how they take that into account. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and it's necessary.
And I also like how you brought up the oil price and how airlines are having so much savings from that. But to counter that, there's one issue with that is to maximize on that, they need to fly as much as possible. So they're not flying as much, they're not saving as much money, but they are still flying. They're still saving money on the routes that they are flying, which is good.
You're absolutely right. When you look at the cost per unit, it goes down with more capacity, more volume. However, and also there are a couple airlines, I think, that are a little overly hedged, especially overseas, which is unfortunate. They're going to pay a pretty heavy price if they can't get out from underneath that. But you're absolutely right. There's a little bit of bad to it, but overall, I think that you're going to see that it really helps cushion some of this anyway.
And my wife is a medical student, and she isn't really from an aviation family or anything like that. So she asked me a good question. And she was like, over the last 10 years, all these airlines have made so much money. It's like, how are they not in a position to weather this kind of storm for a year or 2 years? They've been making billions upon billions and billions of dollars over the last 10, 15, 12 years, whatever it may be. It's like, I guess I just needed to explain how expensive it is to operate an airline. But I know Delta in the last couple of months, and then they have a huge dividend buyout, or they spent $8 billion giving money to investors or doing some other things. So it could have just been unfortunate timing on that end, but it does seem kind of interesting, the fact that they have made so much money over the last 10 years that 1 week can kind of create all this chaos and cause all these cuts and cause them to just kind of stop the bleeding immediately and make you think, well, what happened to all the money you were making before?
Great question. It's a very quick change. I will say this. I do think most of the major airlines, most of the legacy carriers, and many of the low-cost carriers and whatnot in the United States are actually in a pretty good position. But you're right. There were some decisions made, and it's easy to be critical because we have what's called hindsight bias, right? We know now about the pandemic. I look no further than Boeing. Boeing had, I think it was 24 billion, maybe it was 34 billion. I can't remember. But they did a stock buybacks, buying back their stock as a company with all this extra cash that they were making over the last, since the recession, since over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And boy, they could really use that money right now. One of the things that's been lost in all this, and not to keep bringing up bad news, but, we know about the 737 MAX, but just in recent days, it looks like they're going to have to rewire those MAXes. I don't know if you've seen that, but there was a press release about that. That's actually pretty damaging to the carriers that operate MAXes, because that rewiring, you can just imagine the amount of miles and miles and miles of wiring. It has to be rewired now in compliance with the new standards. That's going to take a lot longer than originally anticipated. And those carriers that have the MAX, and now they have the pandemic storm there, that is absolutely impacting, going forward.
You broke up a little bit there. You said those carriers that have the MAX and the pandemic, and then kind of cut out.
Oh, yeah. Those carriers that have the MAX and the pandemic, they have the storm going right now, where they're feeling the effects a lot more than, some of their other competitors.
Yeah. I was kind of thinking about that the other day. I was kind of thinking, is there a chance that the MAX grounding, especially for, say, Southwest, might have prepared them a little bit better than some of the other airlines? They already made the cuts. They're already cut back a little bit, and they already figured out how to operate with less equipment, maybe with a little bit more pilots than they need, and they got kind of already figured out a way to keep making money in that way. Do you think that at all was any kind of a beneficial factor for them?
Well, I think that would be looking for a silver lining, and they may have learned some operational ways of doing business to help accommodate that. I think if you were to ask the management and the people over at Southwest, for instance, would they prefer the MAX to be in service or not be in service? Obviously they'd prefer it to be in service right now. But your point's well taken. Airlines have learned how to manage very efficiently. And, right now that's going to be the operative word is efficiency over the next period.
Absolutely. And like we said, this is kind of an interesting time because we really don't know what's coming next. We don't know, is there a domestic travel ban? Is there going to be other travel bans? Is it going to be kind of a grounding of aviation in general just to help stop the fear? Which I was kind of reading up on travel bans, and I actually saw a quote from the World Health Organization where they questioned blanket travel bans, and they kind of said, this might not actually be as good as you think, and like you need to focus more on finding who has the virus and who is spreading the virus. It's not always through aviation. Granted, aviation does help spread the virus, and it is how it has become global so quick. But they're saying maybe blanket travel bans aren't necessarily the best way to go about this.
Great. Another great question. Of course, not being an epidemiologist, I can't speak with too much authority on this, but I have also read similar journal articles that talked about the same thing, that travel bans, while they're, huge overt signs that shows the public that people are taking steps and also reinforces the seriousness of the situation, in and of themselves as an effective barrier to contain the pandemic, they're not necessarily the most effective. It turns out the most effective things are just, the isolation, the social distancing, some of the different steps that you're seeing people go and through CDC recommendations.
Yeah. And I guess in a way that does kind of put out a travel ban by social distancing, because obviously social distancing, you're not going to get on an airplane with 100 or 200 people. So in a way it's the same thing, but it's just not the airlines banning it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And like you mentioned, and like we've been talking about, a little bit, it's about perception, just reinforcing the seriousness of this. Maybe one thing that will come out of this going forward is, people will be a lot more conscientious about their germs. I mean, I don't know how many times you walked in an airport where somebody was coughing and not covering themselves. You just want to go up to the person and say, "What are you doing, man? Yeah. What are you doing?" And, I'm hoping that maybe some of that behavior as a society, as a culture, we're going to learn. And so maybe there will be some good takeaways from this as well.
Yeah. I mean, we live in a very, very selfish society, right? Like it's all about me. It's all about me taking this trip. It's all about, I might be a little sick, but what's the worst that could happen? That's what that first person with this virus said. What's the worst that could happen? And now here we are with a pandemic on our hands. So maybe you're right. Maybe it does take us a step back to be like, hey man, I'm sick. Like maybe I shouldn't go on this airplane. Maybe I shouldn't fly to China, or maybe I shouldn't fly here. So it could be a good way for us to to learn from history and learn from what's happened.
There's no doubt. And, it's, I fell victim to that as well. I remember talking to some of my students before spring break began, and a lot of them wanted advice on what they thought they should do. And selfishly, I thought for them, you're all young, you're in a demographic that not very much affected by this, go out and enjoy spring break. And I certainly want them to go out and enjoy spring break. But the point is, just because someone's young and they can withstand the virus and it's probably not going to affect them, they can still be vector agents, they'll be carriers, right? And so we all have a responsibility. If we're feeling sick, it's just not right to put other people as part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's not affecting the young, or it's still affecting the young, but it's not, the mortality rate upon the young isn't as big. So obviously, when you're young, you're kind of like, you're superhuman. You think that nothing can really hurt you or affect you, and you're not going to be the reason the world comes down.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, it's hard. I was just in Key West. So, I was traveling too, but when we left, it wasn't what it is now. I feel like, we're all kind of taking this more serious now, and the social distancing is really happening, and going through the airlines and going through the terminals, you can really see that people aren't wanting to travel.
That's right. Yep. And I'm hearing from my friends, I'm sure you're hearing from everybody. We're seeing, massive cancellations and, people not showing up. And that's unfortunate, understandable, but unfortunate. And again, we just have to make sure we can get through this in as quickly a fashion as possible. One thing you talked about earlier, if it's okay to talk about, is about furloughing. I'm getting a lot of questions about furloughing. One of the questions that everyone's wanting to know is there going to be a furlough? And the truth is, the airlines don't know yet, right? They're probably modeling this right now. Everyone probably knows this, but in case some of your viewers, listeners don't know this, it's very expensive for an airline to furlough, right? Because they have to do that in seniority order. And so it causes what's called training churn at the airline. So for the bottom person that gets furloughed out to the street, it can trigger multiple training events above them. I've heard estimates as much as 6 to 8 training events, but the ones I've seen before in some of the modeling is typically anywhere from 1 to 4 training events. So it's very, very expensive. And so it becomes an equation for the airlines. And what it usually comes down to is time. How long does the airline anticipate that they're going to be in this exacerbated economic condition? And if that timeline is anywhere from 6 to 12 months or more, that's when they're going to start looking at, well, we might have to start looking at a furlough here for the long term. I don't think they're there yet. They've certainly frozen their hiring. They've certainly gone into some cost savings modes, gotten rid of some of the discretionary stuff. But I do think if this gets prolonged and it looks like the economic recovery afterwards might be long-term or longer term than expected, then you might start seeing some of these furloughs. We'll know more in the next month or two as the bookings, the people making the bookings, where they're at. That's what the airlines know that we don't. They know what the future is looking like.
Yeah, no, you're very right. And I've seen 2 different things. I've read where it needs to be 2 year of furlough. They need to anticipate at least 2 years of being furlough for it to come out even for the airline. It just doesn't make sense for the airline to furlough unless it's 2 years. But I've also seen, like you said, I've seen just under a year. I've seen like 350 days. I don't know who came up with that math, but someone did all these wild equations and said it takes 365 days or 340 days for this airline to come out even with a furlough. And yeah, you're right. We don't know. I don't think the airlines are there yet. I don't think the airlines know what's going to happen. I honestly think it's a day by day situation, and I'm not trying to spread any fear with that. I don't think I want people to take away with this that they're going to lose their job or they're going to be furloughed, because we honestly don't know. What we can do is look at the history. And I know that you've talked about this in our emails when we were chatting with each other, that you've kind of looked up on the history of furloughs and what has led to that, and maybe what demand, like the lack of demand, or how after 9/11 they cut this many flights, which led to this kind of furlough, which obviously was a little different in this situation. But we have nothing to do but look back on the past. We can't project the future because we don't know,
That's absolutely correct. Just take a look at 9/11, right? We did have some signals going into 9/11 that the economy was starting to soften. However, we still had good profitability at the airlines. Hiring was buzzing. Things are going pretty well. Then, of course, 9/11 happened and overnight changed everything. It did take until mid July of 2004 before we saw the number of passengers return to the pre-9/11. Now, a lot of that was, again, affected by the economic downturn that followed 9/11. That wasn't necessarily just all the fear of it. There probably was, a little more fear of travel right after 9/11, which dissipated over time. But all that being said, it did take about 3 years. You look at SARS, 2002, 2004. We didn't get a big effect of that here in the United States, but internationally we saw that. And it took at the height of the SARS epidemic with some of the Asian carriers, about May 2003 is where we saw the height of that pandemic. It took about 9 months after that to return back to the pre-pandemic areas. You look at the bathtub recession, 2007, 2009, that actually took a long time. We had the swine flu at the end of that, 2009, H1N1. And the levels for passengers returned in 2014. Of course, since then, it's been, all arrows up. So I think if you were going to look at of all these different events that have happened, 2 takeaways. One takeaway is the airline industry always rebounds. It may take, more than a year or 2, but it always rebounds. It's always resilient. And 2, in the case of probably the most analogous experience, which was SARS, 2002, 2004, it was a much more rapid recovery than some of the economic stuff. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I'm not an economist, but my hunch is we're probably going to experience some economic effects as well. I don't know if it's going to be a full-blown recession. I don't know if it's, what it's going to be, but that could also drag out the recovery a little bit.
Yeah, and it's obviously this is all still fear-driven. It's all panic-driven. The virus is bad. The virus could cripple healthcare, because obviously there's not enough beds for people. That's what we're seeing in Italy. We're just seeing the effects of not necessarily the virus itself, but the effects that it has on healthcare, on economies, on airlines. That is more crippling than, say, actually getting the virus itself, depending on age, obviously, and underlying health issues that you may have. But yeah, the quicker we can get a handle on it and the quicker we can understand when this will stop, which I don't know how we do that. That's up to the government, that's up to healthcare, that's up to the crazy scientists that are stuck in labs doing all this right now. But as soon as we can kind of get an understanding of this, and the quicker and the faster, I think the better the recovery will be. But the longer there's questioning, it's going to be a bumpy ride. We don't really know what to expect.
No, I agree. There are some examples out there of where it has worked. It's not getting a lot of press coverage; it's getting a little press coverage. But South Korea had a really big influx. I've spent a lot of time in South Korea personally. That country is very similar to the United States in terms of its openness and freedom to move about and everything. So if you're going to look at an analogous situation, now they did a lot of widespread testing, which is something I don't think we've done here in the United States by all accounts. But they did a lot of testing. But they quickly, it was about 3 weeks of an uptick, and for the last several days, they've really been driving their new cases down. And they did a lot of the social distancing, a lot of the different things we're talking about. And so it can work. And I think that there is hope out there when you look at things like that. And, you do also hear about Italy and Iran and some of the other countries out there that have been devastated. Your hearts goes, it goes out to everyone affected. But, if we follow more like the South Korean model, we might be in a lot better shape, which of course will help everything recover more quickly.
Absolutely. And I kind of have an airline kind of getting it back to the airlines, because I don't want to go too in depth about social distancing or talk about those kind of problems, because I don't have any expertise in that. But what do you kind of where we are now? What do you see of the future of the airlines? What do you see everyone coming out on this? Do you see, like we said, we only have the past to kind of go off of, and we can kind of compare demand and books, and we can kind of see what's going on now. But do you think everyone has an opportunity to make out of this and do better? Or do you think some people, I'm talking about aviation in the United States right now, do you think some of them might have to consolidate or might have to close their doors? Do you think that's I don't like to speculate, but I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it a little bit. How do you kind of see the future of of American aviation right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Just real quickly on your first point, we are pilots, so we like to speculate and conjecture about everything. So we're experts in everything, right? Just ask us. To your second question, the fundamentals of the industry are unchanged long term. There's going to be, every forecast shows air travel to increase worldwide, including in the United States. That's unlikely to change. Definitely in the short term, we're going to see some disruption, but I have absolutely no doubt there's going to be a recovery, and we will return to the levels and we'll start growing again. The question is, when is that going to happen? I don't know that answer, but I have no doubt that long-term the fundamentals are there. As far as consolidation, I think consolidation is always a possibility. I think it was a possibility before this. Certainly, the larger an airline, the conventional wisdom is you get the economies of density, the economies of scope, and it's a big advantage over your competitors. We are starting to see that kind of way out with with the 3-4 big carriers here in the U.S. So I think that's always a possibility. I don't know if it becomes a survival option. I don't know if a company's existentially threatened to the point where they're like, we need to combine with somebody. I don't necessarily see that right now, but that is something we can certainly look for. But as far as people looking long term, when you just look at the retirements, even with a small long-term contraction, which I don't think will happen, the airlines are going to have to replace these pilots. This, by the way, what's going on today will absolutely have an effect on new people coming into the industry. We're going to return to 2009, 2010, where you'll start seeing fewer people come into the industry, start flying. It's just the nature. We have models that absolutely forecast that, driven by hiring at the majors, which is going to be frozen for a little while. So again, it's going to exacerbate the cycle that we keep riding. But the long-term fundamentals are still strong. And if I'm an employee in this industry, I'm going to have to weather the storm. But that's what it is. It's a storm, and it will clear.
Yeah, I agree. You said that perfectly in the last part. This is creating an even bigger bubble than what we already were facing with the hiring. Just stopping hiring even right now they have so many retirements that it's going to be hard to prepare for right now, let alone with who knows how long they stop hiring, whether it's just a couple months or a year or 2 years. It's going to be crazy when this all settles down and when the storm does pass. And going back to what you're talking about consolidation, I like how you said how this was a possibility before this. This might not be this was definitely on the horizon. There was rumors of stuff happening. So if there was consolidation, it's maybe like you said, it's not survival mode. It's not necessarily that they have to do this to survive. It could just be this was always planned and now we're in a better situation to do this. I don't think that's going to happen until we all get a better idea of what the financials will be, until this calms down a little bit to see what the books are saying, because obviously you can't do anything when you don't know what's going to happen next.
That's right. And just from a financial perspective, the reason why your consolidation question is very interesting, the market caps of all the airlines have obviously suffered tremendously, like many stocks in the U.S. But if you were going to buy an airline right now, if you were going to merge, if you were going to take an airline over, from just a financial perspective alone, it might be a good time to do that.
Yeah. So this is another speculation question, but kind of, you've studied this, you've looked at this. Do you see an airline in itself, or maybe even outside the airlines, it could be a 135 company or maybe like freight or something like that. Do you see a part of this industry that maybe won't be as touched as one? Like obviously airlines are more affected by this. Does freight come out better like it did in 9/11? Do the fractionals do okay? Do air ambulance, or is this going to trickle down through every single aspect of aviation?
That's another really interesting question. On the question of freight, anecdotally, we're hearing that, electronic-based markets, Amazon, eBay, different types of vendors, they're doing quite well, right? Because there's no contact delivery, which is the new term, no contact delivery, as people leave it on your doorstep or whatnot. And so we're seeing, everything ordered there. It's going to be interesting to see if that has increased through this. So there's always, as sad as this is, there's from a business perspective, whenever there's ambiguity and uncertainty, and whenever there's a downward trend, there are always some companies that will do better financially during that, right? And so from an aviation perspective, I'm not sure. The air ambulance one's another good question. That seems to be a really growing industry as well. So that's really, healthcare has typically been immune to these types of downturns. So, we'll see something like an air ambulance and whatnot. That remains to be seen, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, you talked about how healthcare can be immune, but it seems like this one could be something that goes right after healthcare, especially if it can overwhelm a healthcare system. That could be very crippling to a whole country and a whole nation and to the economy in general. So it's interesting, and we're going to know more. And it's a day-by-day situation. We're going to know a lot more tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and it still probably looks like it's going to get worse before it gets better. But like you said, the storm will pass. We are going to recover. We don't know how we're going to recover or how bad it's going to be, but we are going to recover.
No, I completely agree. One last little tidbit of advice. This is just me. You can include it if you want, Justin. But, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I used to fly. I absolutely was laughed at by my first officers and whatnot, because I would come on the plane, I would wipe down all the control surfaces. And I just want to advise my fellow aviators out there, it's not so funny now. I hope a lot of you do that. Just the contact points when you fly. I know at the University of North Dakota, we're taking pretty drastic measures. We are still flying on a limited basis. The aircraft are sanitized after every flight professionally. And believe it or not, the pilots are wearing, gloves, latex gloves, when they fly.
Maybe it's going to be a new issuance. Maybe pilots it'll be like the old hats back in the day. Now pilots will have like special leather gloves to wear.
You never know.
Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, and I actually had one more thing to bring up.
Sure.
When this was all starting, and maybe United or Delta, I think it was United, came out first and announced the cuts and announced all this. In my mind, I know this is bad, but I wanted to bring it up because I didn't know if anyone else thought about this too. Every airline is in a very, very tense contract negotiation because times have never been better. Do you think the immediate reaction by the airline was to use this as an excuse for contract negotiations so they didn't have to pay well? Or do you think they kind of knew immediately what the actual damages could be to a company?
So, as I mentioned before, I have a union background. I was actually the MEC chair at American Eagle, now known as Envoy, back in the day. I was also on the contract committee and chair of the contract negotiating committee for some time. So I have a little bit of insight into this. Are airline managements fully capable of using external events to bring leverage at the negotiating table? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, they would never. What are you talking about? Yeah.
Right. Are they doing that in this case? I don't believe so. The thing about it is labor unions out there have become very sophisticated. When I would go and negotiate a contract, even in the early 2000s, right next to me would be a very seasoned attorney, and on the other side of me would be an economist. And so it's going to be really hard to pull one over on the pilot groups out there. If the airline says they have an inability to pay, an inability to do things, they have to prove that. Otherwise, it doesn't exist at the negotiating table. And if they can prove that and it's legit, then it's legit. I don't think that the management teams out there in this particular case are using it to leverage. I do think that those that are in contract talks, it's going to have a profound effect. We've seen some amazing contracts negotiated in the last couple years. UPS just had a tentative agreement not too long ago that was a pretty amazing pay scaled agreement. I don't know how that's all going to be affected going forward, but I do know it'll probably have a pretty good effect at the table. But the airlines will not be able to, and I don't think they would, but they will not be able to particularly use this situation, in my opinion, to leverage. Because if they're saying they don't have the bookings, they have to prove that. They have to show that.
That's good to know. And you're obviously, I didn't know that, but you were a great person to ask that question. But it also comes to the point we're talking about, we're going to need pilots. They're going to need to recover from this. So even if they were to offer less wages, I think the airline and the pilot group both would agree that it's best to do it on a short-term basis, because if they say the airline signs like a 6-year contract where they're the worst paid airline in the world, no one's going to want to go there. Like no one in 2 years, when maybe the hiring is back up to where it was before, everyone's going to choose the other airline. So even I think airlines know now too how important it is to make sure their pilots are looked at and sought after to be flying for that company. I think that the nature of where we are in this industry kind of is helping the pilot group with pay and where that comes from when that time does come.
No doubt. We've also seen that trickle down to the regional airlines. We all know what regional pilots used to make even 5 years ago. Now, of course, we're seeing a tremendous amount of increases. So what you're saying is absolutely correct. There is a market effect as well. Piloting, at least initially, can be a free agency type market. As far as contract terms, from a pilot perspective, the general rule of thumb is when times are bad, you try to negotiate more things that are longer term, job security, furlough protections, retirement things that are going to be more costly to the company down the road rather than today. When times are good, you typically go for the short term monetary gains, compensation, work rules that increase that. And then, of course, the company's going to be on the other side of that equation, right?
Right, yeah. They got the same people from negotiating power as well. They're smart. They know what they're doing.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
They have all the money to pay. They'd probably rather pay money in the best negotiators and give a single dollar sometimes.
They have very good negotiators. Let me just say that.
Absolutely. And you brought up the regionals again. I will let you go eventually, I promise. But I just, who determines the regionals' fate? Because obviously they fly under mainline contracts. So when Delta's parking 40% of their airplanes globally, they don't really talk about if that's going to be 40% 300 airplanes. They don't really talk about if that's going to be 300 of Delta owned airplanes, or is that going to be a mix of some of the regional carriers? Like, I feel like it's tough being a regional pilot because you kind of don't really have a say, and their company doesn't necessarily have a say in what happens. It's kind of all based on the big three.
Right. So great question about the regionals. There's also a lot of uncertainty there. We're not privy to the contracts, the services agreements that are signed between the majors and the regionals, but I am almost positive that in almost all of them, you will see language that talks about, force majeure or acts of God or pandemics, probably even to that level, where major airlines can absolutely change the terms if they need to. And so that's going to be something to watch. I think the fact that fuel has become so low right now, the cost of fuel is so low, that actually helps the 50-seat market because, you also have pilots that aren't paid as much. And so, and I have also just anecdotally, when to the heart of your question, I did start looking at OAG data as the airline started changing their markets. And what I saw was they trimmed a lot from their contested heavy volume markets, like maybe like Chicago, Atlanta, or, New York, Los Angeles, where there was a lot of capacity to begin with. I'm not seeing that as much. At least I could, again, it's a little bit anecdotal. I have not done a formal analysis. I've not seen that as much on the thinner, lower served markets, into the future. But, again, it's a fluid situation. There's a lot of uncertainty, and the majors could absolutely force regionals to park airplanes if they deem it's necessary for their survival.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of like we talked about earlier when Ed was giving up his salary for 6 months. Like, it's going to be all hands on deck to make sure that everyone can survive, and everyone's going to have to play their part, which is going to be unfortunate. But I mean, we all want a job at the end of the day, and we all want to have that retirement whenever that time comes. So it's just kind of where we are right now, which is unfortunate. And I mean, I guess I was trying to think of one more question. Might have slipped in my mind, but I appreciate you coming on. If I think about it before I end this, I'll ask you again. But I want to get you on again here in the future and kind of keep you on and maybe ask you some more questions as this goes on. So I look forward to creating more of a space for you to come on and talk and eventually tell your story and talk about who you are. 'Cause it sounds like you have a very interesting story of where you are today. And I really look forward to this episode coming out. I think it's going to be a good one. Like I said, we're just talking about facts. We're not trying to spread fear. Well, I figured out the question. Here we go. So in September 11th, and even kind of in the bathtub recession, like talk about, they came up with the baggage fees to kind of make some more cash. That was kind of protecting them and give them some more money to work with in the future. What did you see, or has there been any like ramblings of what airlines have always wanted to do, maybe to charge more money to protect themselves more? Or do you think that they're kind of currently figuring that out right now, what they can do in the future to keep more money? Are they going to stop maybe doing dividend buyouts? Are they going to stop giving up billions and billions of dollars? Or how do you see them trying to protect themselves for this even more in the future? Or do you think they can't? Do you think this is kind of just where we are in the industry?
No, I think they definitely can protect themselves. So you're absolutely going to see some of the dividends payouts, some of the stock buybacks, the employee bonuses. Some of those things are absolutely going to not be a reality for a little while anyway. But onto your question of ancillary revenue, Wall Street has been pounding the airline industry for years to unlock more in ancillary income. They believe it's a gold mine, and by most estimates, the airlines have really only gone to roughly 50% of their capability on ancillary income. And just to keep this in perspective, it's changed a little bit in the last couple of years, but there was a time, 2010, 11, 12, where ancillary income represented the entire profit margin of the industry. That was the old joke. We don't make money from hauling passengers. We make money from hauling passengers' bags, right? That was the old joke. So, for instance, I'm a gold flyer. I'm a gold medallion member at Delta Airlines, which is the second from the bottom. I travel just enough to get some benefits. I don't have to pay bag fees right now because I'm a gold member, and I can also have to pay overweight fees for my overweight bags, et cetera. There's a lot of meat on the bone. The airlines absolutely can start increasing these costs. And there's no doubt in my mind they've had very smart analytical people look at these and figure out where they can squeeze more revenue if need be. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think that's a very real possibility. And from a consumer point of view, it's irritating. You hate that, but it's not going to. The studies are very clear on this. It does not change your behavior. You're still going to take the flight. And so it's basically free money for the airlines to pick up. Southwest would disagree. They've doubled down and gone on the other side of it and launched, a multi-million-dollar campaign on the other side saying bags fly free, right? So you've got two different philosophies there. But at least on the American Delta United front, they've still got a lot of room. And then you couple that with the fuel savings. They've got some tools at their disposal. They can make the right decisions, and I think do okay.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. You brought up two good facts. It's going to be interesting on a consumer basis to see these costs. People are going to be mad about it. But like you said, there's been studies that show it doesn't change anything. People still fly. So it's going to be interesting to see how the consumer reacts. And you also brought up Southwest going anti-bag fee. Is this maybe now them realizing, hey, it'd be really nice to have a couple $1 billion extra right now? It's like, how does that hurt their loyalty? How does that hurt them as an airline from where they stand? And how does that change the outlook that Southwest has on things? It could change that.
Yeah, it's almost a religious issue for Southwest. I don't want to speak for them at all. I don't see them ever. I mean, it's possible. They'll tell you that they didn't leave several $billion. They'll tell you that by not charging bag fees, they have formulas that show that they were able to spur extra activity. And so it's just a different philosophy. It'll be interesting to see if they change their philosophy. I don't think you'll ever see that Southwest, but I've been famously wrong about things before. So
we'll mark it down. In 10 years, we'll come back and I'll ask you, be like, hey, you were wrong or you were right.
There you go.
Yeah, but we'd also say that we never thought Southwest would be without a 737, and there's also been rumblings in the future that, hey, could this be the final time that they move on? So, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty at Southwest, too, what could be happening. So, interesting times all the way around, even before this disease and this pandemic has been created. But Jim, those are all the questions I have for you now. I'm not going to air my exit again, I promise. But thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to doing this with you maybe in a week or maybe in a couple of days as things keep changing, because I think it's just important to get the information out there and have these conversations. So thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Justin, thank you for having me. I'm happy to come back anytime. Thanks
Absolutely.
so much.
We'll definitely be in touch, and have a good one. Wash your hands and stay safe.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Avination, that is a wrap of this episode. If you want to continue this discussion, please start commenting on my Pilot the Pilot Instagram post. You can find me at Pilot the Pilot. You can also email me, pilotthepilothq@gmail.com. If you would like to have a conversation about this or possibly even come on the podcast, just let me know what you think. I'm open to having a conversation about this and seeing what you think. Like I said earlier, please share this. Please review us on iTunes. And please be safe and wash your hands. Avination, that's all I have for you today. I will be releasing the next interview podcast on Tuesday. It's going to be with Anthony Pence. Anthony was a student with me at Ohio State, so it'll be another great story. And then a week from that will be the episode with my dad, which will be really interesting. And it's also, the times have changed since that episode, so maybe I'll get him back on and get his thoughts on what is happening right now. Avination, I hope you have a great day. Like I said earlier, stay safe, wash your hands, and thanks for listening. Have a good one.